Spaceship has landed. True logic. Okay, so today I am going to discuss the relationship between US President Donald Trump and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-Un. Right? US President Donald Trump and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-Un have become very friendly on the international stage. They've been setting meetings together, opening new negotiations. They even wrote letters to each other, which, although they have not released to the public, they each treat it like love letters from two teenagers. Recently, Trump was the first U.S. president to step across the demarcation line and enter North Korea. Yet, this relationship has more of a soap opera effect than it has led to any substantive change. Right? The Hill reported that Donald Trump once remarked how he fell in love with Kim Jong-un. Those are his exact words. Fell in love. Which is an odd phrase for a democratic leader to say about a brutal international dictator. Right? Okay. Trump also stated during a rally for Republican Senate candidate and State Attorney General Patrick Morrisey of West Virginia that he and Kim Jong-un are very much alike. Which again is another disturbing statement to hear from one of the most prominent Democratic leaders in the world towards one of the most brutal dictators in the world. Right? Trump is certainly all too friendly towards Kim Jong-un, and his friendly attitude towards him is as disturbing as his praise of Vladimir Putin. Right? Both Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin are non-democratic rulers with a history of horrendous human rights violations. Both individuals are also leaders of a government considered hostile to U.S. long-term interests. Donald Trump gets along with Kim Jong-un because they are exactly similar personalities with similar upbringings. Right? Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump are both essentially quote-unquote trust fund babies, insofar as they each inherited their status from their father, right? Neither individual has achieved or accomplished anything successfully of their own accord and do more posturing and damage control than anything else. While Kim Jong-un is a total dictator and thus actually has the established precedent to carry out his violent desires, both Trump and Kim Jong-un have promoted violence against political opponents. Trump once called the U.S. media the enemy of the people. His continuous disrespect to the press, i.e. referring to the New York Times as fake news, CNN as fake news and so forth, and his disregard for traditional presidential procedure, his open attacks against his own intelligence community, etc., are signs of his dictatorial attitude. Not to mention his desire to throw a huge military parade, which sources report he wishes to include tanks on the mall steps. Right? This superfluous display of military power is common amongst dictators flexing. Stalin would be proud of such a military parade. However, this friendship or political romance that Donald Trump has with Kim Jong-un has done little to deter Kim's nuclear interests. At the moment, negotiations between the two leaders have not seen North Korea express explicit interest in discontinuing their nuclear weapons program. Kim Jong-un's largest concerns are security-related as well as maintaining power. Additionally, he wants the heavy economic sanctions leveraged against the state removed. However, the U.S. government is unlikely to remove economic sanctions against North Korea. Without the removal of these sanctions, though, it is improbable that North Korea will shutter its nuclear weapons ambitions. So, the negotiations will seemingly always end in an impasse. Furthermore, one might argue that this relationship benefits Kim Jong-un more and hurts long-term U.S. interests. A key component of the U.S.'s international legitimacy is its strong democracy and its moral standing. Theoretically speaking, the US is a shining example of what a strong, functioning democracy should look like. However, Trump's open embrace of authoritarian leaders with a history of human rights violations, in addition to the ongoing humanitarian crisis involving migrants and asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border, ruins this holier-than-thou democratic narrative. Trump's election, attitude, and decisions create an unpredictability that deters our long-term interests and allies and delegitimizes the US's moral credibility. In fact, in 2018, The Hill and other political news outlets reported that German Chancellor Angela Merkel expressed incredulity in terms of the relationship between the US and Europe, believing that Europe can no longer rely on US protection and that Europe should take its own destiny into its own hands. However, simply being granted face-to-face meetings, even being openly praised, does, in fact, legitimize Kim Jong-un's regime, right? It has not been widely reported that Trump has once yet challenged Kim Jong-un on his human rights violations. For all intents and purposes, Trump entertains Kim Jong-un as if they were already allies, or as if he were not in any form a brutal dictator. This behavior, especially when analyzed from a higher perspective, which takes into account Trump's lackluster attitude in regards to the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the hands of the Saudi Arabians, most likely directed by Mohammed bin Salman, current prince and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, right? This creates the impression that the US is perfectly fine with dictators, murderers, and anti-democratic leaders. And this is one of the primary concerns. Trump has already partially damaged US credibility in an irreversible way, which ultimately hinders long-term political interests. If these same practices continues, he's going to make the US appear even more ridiculous to those that still value integrity and true democratic principles, right? To openly praise a brutal dictator, to state that he doesn't think Putin's a bad guy, that the US should be much more friendly with Putin, it's a completely total apathetic, for all intents and purposes, response towards the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and his attempt to even deny the intelligence gathered by his own intelligence community, which pointed out that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was most certainly ordered by Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman. All of these things are Donald Trump's acceptance of cruelty, human rights violations, murder, and brutality on behalf of non-democratic leaders, dictators, and rulers, right? Which has fundamentally been against the international practices of the U.S. society and U.S. government, which is a pro-democratic, pro-human rights society. Theoretically speaking, factually speaking, human rights and democratic societies go hand in hand, right? As I stated before, the primary aspect of the US's legitimacy is that it's a shining example of a true democracy which supports the freedom and voice of all. Subsequently, you would think that the leader of such a country would oppose the murder of one of its own journalists by a dictator who killed him for expressing that very same sentiment. Yet, Donald Trump seems much more like these dictators and non-democratic leaders than anything else. This is definitely going to delegitimize the U.S.'s standing, and it also further creates a security concern for the U.S., right? Because narrative is a key component to legitimacy, right? It's not only the story we tell, but it's how that story gets told and who tells it that offers legitimacy and credence to a governmental system, a leader, and so forth, right? And when Donald Trump creates this moral ambiguity and illegitimacy in the eyes of the world, it gives flame to terrorist groups and leaders who can then use that and leverage it to individuals, right? If I'm a member of Al-Qaeda attempting to recruit an individual, I could say, well, look at the U.S. society, who claims to be such a shining example of democratic leadership and rule, yet look at Donald Trump's open embrace of murder and human rights violations. They are not as they say. They are hypocrites. They are liars. They are con men and so forth. You should instead join our cause because we are true and so forth, right? I mean, this is some of the rhetoric that I imagine these individuals would use, right? Now, most people would not fall for it, sure, but some certainly would, which is my point. It's that this behavior and this attitude not only delegitimizes the U.S.'s moral standing on the international stage, but that delegitimization of the U.S. on the international stage creates a window for terrorists to use against us. Let me know what you think in the comments. What do you think of Donald Trump's relationship with Kim Jung-Un? Do you think it's ultimately beneficial to the U.S.'s long-term interests? Or do you think this just simply makes Kim Jong-un appear more legitimate and acceptable on the international stage? Spaceship has blasting off, and that's true logic.